The epistle reading is Ephesians chapter 4, beginning with the 25th verse. Therefore, putting away falsehood, let everyone speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another. Be angry, but do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and give no opportunity to the devil. Let the thief no longer steal, but rather let him labor, doing honest work with his hands, so that he may be able to give to those in need. Let no evil talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for edifying, as fits the occasion, that it may impart grace to those who hear. And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, in whom you were sealed for the day of redemption. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you with all malice, and be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you. Therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
And these are God's words to us, and they are about words. God talks to us about our talk. How do we talk? Paul at the end says to be imitators of God. This whole business of imitation, some people say it's a great form of flattery. I remember when my children were little, sometimes this fight would erupt in the back of the car, and you would hear, "Hey, she's copying me," or whatever. We always imitate someone, whether we realize it or not. It's how we become whatever it is that we become. When I was a little boy, I had baseball coaches who taught me how to swing, but that did not really matter. When I swung, I attempted to mimic the swing of Mickey Mantle. The results were very different, but I wanted to swing the way Mickey Mantle, he was my hero. I wanted to swing. This has bled into adult life for me. We're always unwittingly imitating someone, even in the way that we talk, even in the way that I have preached. When I was a young preacher, I went through a phase where I was obsessed with the comedian Steve Martin. I would listen to Steve Martin all week, and then it would come time to preach. And I'd be up here like, "Hey," and da-da-da, and people are like, "What's wrong with him?" And then I had a Garrison Keillor phase, where I'd listen to Garrison Keillor all week, and I'd start preaching, and it'd be like, "Oh, Jesus and the disciples went to Samaria." So, we're always imitating someone in the way that we talk. When Paul talked to us about how to talk, I wonder if he had in mind that verse from Psalm 19, which says, "O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be pleasing to you." That's something to think about. Are the words of our mouths pleasing to God? I don't know what that looks like. I don't think that means it's sugary politeness or something boring and dull, but is there a Christian way to talk? Do we think enough about the power of our words? I mean, with our words, we bless. You can say, "I love you." Or a parent says to a child, "I'm so proud of you." Or an employer says to a worker, "Great job, I really value you." Or even something that seems innocuous as a way of blessing. You say, "Hey, some of us are getting together, we'd love for you to come." These are words of blessing. "I'm praying for you," whatever. With words, we also inflict great harm. Sometimes someone says, "I don't love you anymore." Harping criticism at work. Sometimes there are painful words that must be spoken, but it makes them no less painful. The doctor says, "I'm so sorry, it's malignant." With words we bless, with words we inflict pain. How do we think about our talk? This is especially difficult, I might add, for somebody like me. When I take the Myers-Briggs test, I grade out as an ENTJ, and it turns out, when you read the little analysis of what ENTJs are like, it says the following, that how ENTJs know what they're thinking is they talk, and then they say, "Oh, that's what I was thinking." And this gets me in so much trouble all the time. I wish I were one of those other letters where they think and then speak. Is there a way that we can talk that would please God? Well, here's how Paul counsels us. It seems easy, but it's so difficult. Paul says, let everyone speak the truth. That seems like the simplest thing. George Washington, I cannot tell a lie. I did chop down the cherry tree. Telling the truth. But telling the truth gets really complicated now, doesn't it? I never thought about this until I went off to college and I was taking a course and we read Immanuel Kant, who posed the following dilemma. An axe murderer comes to your door and he asks me, is your wife at home? And do I say, oh yeah, she's up in the bedroom? Or do I say, no, she ran out to the Harris Teeter? It's an honesty. What's the function of truth? Well, in our world, it's even way more complicated than that, right? If you think about our media culture, our political culture, there's this kind of BS everywhere. And let me just vent about this for a moment. This past week, we had the Democratic National Convention here in Charlotte. I have Republican friends who vacated the city kind of as their own little protest. And one came back, and what he said to me yesterday, he said, I'm glad I was not here to have to listen to those lying Democrats. I was like, grow up. Get so tired of that because the very week before, the Democrats were saying, I'm so tired of listening to these lying Republicans. We are clueless about truth. All we know is self-serving ideology. And so truth comes to mean nothing. We just want to hear stuff that we like and that panders to us. We don't know anything about truth, telling the truth. I can tell you how bad it is. I discovered this about 15 years ago. Had a peculiar set of circumstances that landed me in a room with Jimmy Carter for 30 minutes. And you think, hey, cool. Well, what do you talk about? Like, hey, how was the White House? Yeah, it just seems dumb. But one thing, though, that I asked him, and I'm glad I asked him, was this. I said, what are you proudest of from your years in the White House? You know what he said? He said, I'm very proud that most Sundays, even with all my responsibilities, I was able to teach Sunday school. And then he said, also, I never lied to the American people. Now, I told this a Sunday after it happened. Some Republican grabbed me on the way out of church and said, he was lying to you when he said that. Oh, come on. Here's the first Christian rule of speech. Always tell the truth. Always, we can get that done. Always tell the truth. Although, I have to add, don't always tell all the truth. I have married couples that come to me, they're having a lot of trouble. And they've made a mistaken notion often, which is that they think the key to a happy marriage is to be able to communicate effectively. This is so wrong. Because a lot of times couples have trouble because they're communicating so effectively. And they're saying very true things to one another. I had a couple recently, and they were saying things to each other like, you're fat. The dinner was burned. You don't make enough money. I don't like your mother. All true things. And all very hurtful. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, often we combat our evil thoughts most effectively if we absolutely refuse to allow them to be expressed in words. It's like he acknowledges you're going to have like bad junk in your head. But the best way to combat that, because God's interested in not just the words of your mouth, but also the meditations of your heart. The best way to combat that is just don't say it out loud. God would have us know when to shut up. We always tell the truth. We don't always tell everything that happens to be true. The way Paul describes this is enormously important. We just don't think about it enough. Paul says, give no opportunity to the devil. And it's like, you don't have to believe in a red guy with a pitchfork breathing fire to believe in the devil. There is a very personal evil force that is trying to get in your head and undo you all the time. And Paul says, give no opportunity to the devil. One of our Sunday school classes, I believe, started talking about the devil this week, and one of them contacted me and said, what would you recommend? And I said, well, the one thing that I always think is important is what Thomas Merton said, is that what the devil wants above all else is attention. Like the devil hates it if you don't pay him any attention. So what the devil wants is a lot of attention and to get credit for a lot of things. And if we're obsessing on the devil is so very pleased. The other thing that the devil really likes, Paul describes it and warns us against it. Paul says, give no opportunity to the devil, semicolon. Let all bitterness, wrath, anger, and slander be put away from you. I better read that to you again. Let all bitterness, wrath, anger, and slander be put away from you. We live in a society that believes that bitterness and slander are good. We live in a society that believes that bitterness and slander, that's kind of what God would want us to do. And we feel kind of smug and self-righteous if we are bitter and if we slander somebody or another. But be very clear, bitterness and slander are not of God. Bitterness and slander are not pleasing to God. Bitterness and slander are something that the devil finds to be delicious. It's an opportunity for the devil. If you want to get closer to God, and you do, every one of us in this room, you'd like to be closer to God. If you want to get closer to God, here's a simple step. When somebody sends you one of those angry, venomous emails, delete it instead of forwarding it. Or maybe even respond to the person and say, I don't do that. If you're tempted to make a catty remark about someone, just don't. If you hear some gossip, and it can be very true, and it can be under the guise of, concern for the person that the gossip is about, you know what you can do? You can just not repeat it. If you want to get closer to God, think about your bitterness and your slander. Paul says, give no opportunity to the devil, but let bitterness and slander be put away from you. The devil loves rancor. Paul says, let no evil talk come out of your mouth. I don't think God's prudish or overly sensitive, but yet God says to us, let no evil talk come out of your mouth. I think about all the off-color humor. I think God likes humor as much as the next person, but a lot of our off-color humor, if you think about it, it's demeaning to somebody. It's demeaning to a woman. It's demeaning to somebody of another color. It's demeaning to somebody who thinks differently. It's so demeaning, and the devil loves it when we have demeaning attitudes and words. Paul says, let no evil talk come out of your mouths, and then he adds, instead, say things that are edifying. Say things that impart grace to those who hear. Can we find the words to encourage other people? When I was a little boy, I was taught, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. That's a bald-faced lie. Words really do hurt us. Words belittle. Words can heal, but words can really hurt. Now, I hadn't thought about this until this week, but I think this is maybe the most important thing. It's not just that our words hurt other people. Our words hurt God. When God hears us kind of angry, gossiping, belittling, off color, it grieves God. And we don't really want to grieve God, do we? Here's something I thought about. If someone listened to you talk for 3 years, let's say somebody's doing a PhD study and their study is to listen to someone talk for 3 years. And for 3 years, they record everything you said, every email that you typed, every handwritten note that you sent. They took all the words that come out of you and they compiled it all. What would they conclude about you? What kind of person would they conclude that you would be? Would God seem to be evident at all? Would this person conclude that you're kind, that you encourage others? What about over many years? Think about the whole scope of your lifetime. As the years go by in your talking, does your talking becoming more pleasing to God as you get older, or is it becoming less pleasing to God? Is your talk over many years becoming more encouraging to others, or is it less encouraging and more belittling? I tell you, I thought about a guy recently who 20 years ago, he was a great encourager. He was a beacon of sunshine. You would get around him, and he just had positive things to say, and he would tell you how good looking you were and how great you were doing and how much he thought you were. He would always brighten your day with his words. Something's happened to him over 20 years. He's gotten crusty. He's gotten angry. I think he's gotten fearful. And as he's aging, he's become meaner. Now, I don't really like to hear him talk much because it's all just grousing, rancor. And you leave just with a cloud around you after you've talked to him. How do we talk? How do we encourage others? You know, another thing that Dietrich Bonhoeffer said that I think is pretty cool is he had a community of Christians that were trying to be faithful to God in the thick of Nazism's rise in Germany, and that was hard. And when he had people together, he talks about how do we live together as Christians. And one of the things that he said is, this is his rule of thumb, is never talk about someone who is not present. That's very hard to do. So I would amend his rule a little to this. Never say anything negative about someone who is not present. If you're somewhere and I'm not there and you think of something nice to say, go right ahead. It's great. But this whole negative thing with someone who is not there, what do we do? They're negatives. They're critical things that we think of. What do we do? It reminds me of an old joke, and I may have told some of you this before, and if I have, be merciful to me with your words. It's an old joke about the preacher. There's a preacher, and he goes to a new church, and it's his first Sunday. He's very nervous indeed. So what he does is he writes the best sermon he's capable of, and he polishes it, and he practices it until it's really good, and he gets a haircut, and he presses his shirt, and he goes over, and he's just determined to do his best. So he gets in the pulpit, and he preaches his sermon. At the end of the service, people are coming out, and they're shaking his hand. Welcome, glad you're here. He thinks it's going pretty well, but there's this one guy who's kind of got this going on. And I'm looking at him. And so finally, he walked up to the man and says, "Hi." The guy says, "Hi." He says, "What do you do around here?" The man says, "What I do around here is I find fault with the preacher." And he added, "I'm good at what I do." Well, this made the preacher very nervous indeed. And he said, "Well, when you find fault with the preacher, what do you do?" The man said, "When I find fault with the preacher, I lift him up." If you find fault with someone, I do not congratulate you. That's no big achievement. The question is, what do you do? Do you lift up that other person? There's a lot more that I should say about this passage today, but time's moving on. For instance, we could talk about some of the most important words that are so pleasing to God, words of forgiveness. You know, every one of us in this room, we need to hear words of forgiveness. We need to utter words of forgiveness. That's kind of the ultimate Christian talk, isn't it? There's also the issue of talking to God. You know, what do we say to God? And how does it seem to God? Is it pleasing to God? I mean, sometimes our talk to God must not be pleasing to God because we don't say much. We're like too busy to call. Or when we talk to God, it's like, okay, God, give me, I've got a list, I'm mad, but we do this with God. Is our talk to God pleasing? Do we say things to God like, "Oh, thank you. What do you want me to do? You are great." Encouraging words even to God. And then there's this. I mean, Bonhoeffer says that at times you don't talk. That's got to apply to our talking with God, right? Some of the time you just don't talk. And if you say anything at all, you say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." And you listen. And you hear God. And then you know how to talk. And then the imitation of God begins.